Hello, carbon-based listeners and silicon-powered friends. Welcome to Mastering the Machine, the podcast where humans and automation collide in perfect harmony. I'm your host, Frank Lamb, and whether you're flesh and blood or circuits and codes, we're here to explore industrial automation together. From factory floors to digital cores, we're exploring how machines are reshaping our world, one algorithm at a time. So plug in, power up, and let's master the machine together. Hello, everyone. Today's podcast is on American Beverage Depot, which is a company down in Miami, Florida, and some of the modifications that I've helped them do over the last 12 years. This would qualify as a successful upgrade of control systems and even their way of doing business with MES and ERP systems. So kick back and let's talk about American Beverage Depot. On their website, American Beverage Depot's advertisement states, American Beverage Depot has its roots in the Argentinian traditional bottling industry. Our state-of-the-art facility opened in Miami, Florida in September of 2004. American Beverage Depot manufactures end-product beverages in 3 different platforms: 1,000 milliliter Tetra bricks, 200 milliliter Tetra bricks, and custom-designed 16.9 ounce bottles to a convenient 2-liter format. And I'll be filling you in on what some of those things are. Indeed, I didn't know a lot about the beverage industry before I started working for American Beverage Depot. I think I've mentioned this before in previous podcasts. American Beverage Depot is really my only remaining systems integration customer, and I've dealt with them over the past 12 years and done a few other jobs on the side, but they are my primary focus when it comes to doing projects anymore. And one of the reasons for this is I've also mentioned I really don't like to take long-term jobs that I have to be at for, say, 6 months at a time. And of course, American Beverage Depot being in Miami, it's about 1,000 miles from me in Nashville. So I generally drive down there, and sometimes I've flown a few times, but when I drive, I can bring a lot of my tools and different things, and I usually spend 1 to 2 weeks there at a time. And then there's really no commitment as far as a specific time that I have to be back. I can do some work remotely, etc. My first visit to American Beverage Depot was after I started teaching for automation training in Canada. One of the instructors there had done an online class for Juan Pablo Garbin, and he is the son of the person who at the time owned the company and started American Beverage Depot in 2004. And Juan Pablo was pretty young at that time. I want to say he was probably 25 years old, and he really didn't know anything about the PLCs and the controls that they had in the plant, and the father didn't either. So there was really nobody there that had software to be able to go online with different PLC processors and things like that. They were at the mercy of the vendors who had put the equipment in there. And they had a lot of, as they mentioned, kind of state-of-the-art. It was, I would say, state-of-the-art at the end of the 90s, and maybe by 2004 it was somewhat cutting edge, but the control logics, of course, had already come out, and they did have Siemens S7-400s, S7-300s, which at the time were about as advanced as Siemens got, and then they had a Slick 500 running their batching system. They didn't have any PLC 5s. They had a kind of a mixture, mostly of Siemens and Allen Bradley, and then they had a bunch of fillers, and the fillers were GE 9030s, which at that time, I want to say there was a newer processor out, certainly by GE at that time, but it very specialized equipment, and you wouldn't have custom machine builders usually build this kind of thing. The people that build this kind of equipment are generally specialized on the beverage industry. One of these would be Seidel. Seidel is European. I'm not sure which country is their headquarters, but a lot of their equipment was built and designed in Italy, integrated from Brazil, And a lot of the comments, of course, would be in Spanish because the end user was in Spanish and some of the people who started it up. So one of the things I found interesting is when I would go into the programs, there was no English in there. Everything was in Spanish, Portuguese, maybe a little bit of Italian. There was some German stuff even in there in the Siemens. Of course, that's pretty common with Siemens. So I'm sure for people at American Beverage Depot and maintenance and people like that, this was somewhat confusing. But they started having some device net problems, and after Juan Pablo, the owner's son, started taking these classes from Mike Henry at Automation Training, he called Mike Henry back after the class and said, could you come down here from Canada and help us with some of our problems? And of course, Mike Henry at the time was probably coming up on 70 years old and really worked directly for Automation Training, so he wasn't able to come down to the United States. And of course, there's some visa issues and things like that. You can, of course, slide across the border and say you're doing something else, but really that's not what they were set up to do. So Mike told Juan Pablo that there was another instructor, myself, in Tennessee that might be able to come down and help him since I did systems integration. I was another teacher for Automation Training. I was pretty new at that time. I'd only taught a few classes. But in any case, I flew down to American Beverage Depot, and I met first very briefly Juan Pablo, and he introduced me to the plant manager, who is Luis de la Vega, who introduced me to the maintenance manager, Guillermo Sparacino. And Guillermo is one of the busiest people you've ever seen, so he didn't have a lot of time with me. But they brought me into the syrup batching room and introduced me to Wilfredo. And of all these people, I'd say Juan Pablo probably speaks the best English. Luis speaks some English too. He's from Peru. Juan Pablo grew up in the United States and, of course, speaks fluent English, went to high school here. He's was almost a tennis pro, and he went to high school, a tennis-oriented high school near Tampa. But I'll leave a little bit more on Juan Pablo a little bit later. I got to know him very well as time went on. But my first adventure there, at the time, I'd say I was 53 years old in 2013, went out there, and it was August. And it was very hot, and they had problems with these, mostly the device net sensors that were on the tanks in the not the batching room, there's a big tank room there, and it had 4 big tanks where they mix the batches from the dissoluter room with fructose and water, and then from those tanks, the finished product flows out to the different fillers and things, and to the pasteurizers, and then to the fillers. So I went out and looked at all this device net stuff, and really their maintenance people were not electrically oriented, and the humidity and electrical problems that they have in Miami had really kind of done a number on a lot of the device net nodes. So what they would do is sometimes when a sensor wasn't acting right, they would simply move the sensor to a different I/O point, and then they would have Seidel or somebody remotely drill into the machine and reassign the I/O to a different point. Or they would rewire things, or there was just a lot of problems. And of course, they also did washdown. This is a somewhat sanitary facility, so they would do washdown, and the humidity and all the water in the area, even though these were IP67 rated device net nodes, they still would malfunction. And so they didn't really know what all was wrong, but I went and helped them figure out what those problems were. We reassigned some things. Of course, I got online with the program. They didn't even have really a good copy of the program, so I went online with my computer, connected to the PLC program with the oldest one the newest one that they had for a Slick 500, and started commenting things and started reassigning and learning how the program worked. And 2014, I made a couple more trips out there, and they would have me come in and even modify some of the syrup line. And at the time, they had some young guys that would maybe be able to learn a little bit of Slick 500 programming, and I would help them learn I'm trying to remember who was in there in 2014. I don't think they had hired either of the two Cuban guys that I'll talk about a little bit later. But they had somebody, I think Leo, one of the maintenance guys, was able to possibly go online with something and maybe, change a timer or something like that. But they really didn't have anybody else other than the owner of the plant, right, who is Juan Pablo. Well, he became the owner later after his father retired. I learned that process pretty well. I learned how they batch and the flow of all the product. At the time, I didn't know about things like flow switches and piping and how the process itself worked. And this is an interesting note. If you ever get into a new process, it's very, very difficult to go into a process that you don't understand and immediately have any major effect on the process. And the reason for this is you go through the program and you know what it's kind of doing, but you don't really know what it's supposed to do. So you really have to learn the process, and nobody wants to pay you to learn the process. So the best way to do this when you get into a new plant is do small jobs first. Go over and over and over the program, make some small changes, and then when it comes time to do what I had to start doing in 2015, you will be able to do it. But it takes a year or two. You're not going to learn this stuff in a week or two, and even if you spend a couple months learning, who wants to pay you to learn for months without any result coming back? So as I mentioned, it was a Slick 500 with RSView 32, which was an old SCADA program from Allen Bradley. And then in 2015, they decided, we want to put 3 new tanks in here. Can you help us do this? And so I said, sure. I know the program fairly well. How is this going to be done? And they said, well, Luis, the plant manager, is a mechanical engineer, and he can do the pipe design. And so I looked at the existing piping, and Luis had drawn things by hand, and I evaluated the project, and I said, well, we have a couple problems here. One big problem is you have a Slick 500 that is, it has 64K of memory, which is the biggest Slick 500 they had, and you've used about 62K of memory in the program. So you're pretty much used up. And you have this device net, and myself, I really don't care much for device net. So we have an opportunity here to try to get this to Ethernet IP, which is really the best choice for Allen Bradley remote devices. And so what I came up with is I said, let's put a compact Logix in here to handle all the Ethernet IP, and we will transfer information from the Slick to the compact Logix. And ideally, what you would like to do is eventually migrate to a full-blown control Logix and make everything Ethernet IP. And they said, well, sounds good to us. We don't really know. So over that year, we designed a fully new piping system, added a whole bunch of valves, added a lot of new nodes. And this was fairly straightforward from my perspective because all I did was duplicate the logic in the 4 existing tanks. And I made a new pair of tanks 5 and 6, that duplicated tanks 1 and 2, and they would be able to switch from each of the pairs of tanks. So this took a while. Obviously, they hired some people in to do all the piping, and Luis did all the mechanical design, and by 2016, we had these tanks in, everything was working, and we started migrating the Slick 500 and the compact Logix into a new control Logix system. Now, I say new, the L70 series was out by 2015, 2016, but we used an L63 processor, and that's what's in there today, and it was, I would say, version 19 of control Logix, which is enough. RS Logix 5000 version 19 was a good stable platform, and it really made it a much better system. It was much easier to deal with, but we still had this RSView 32, which was effectively a fairly obsolete version of SCADA from Allen Bradley. They had moved on to Factory Talk View SE, but of course everything from Allen Bradley is quite expensive. So I had mentioned Ignition, which is inductive automation SCADA platform, to Juan Pablo, and he started investigating it, and he bought a server worth of ignition. He put ignition in there in 2016 and started creating some back-end database stuff and asked me to do the nice pretty screens, duplicate the RSView 32 screens. And so I started that for them, and then they kind of took that over themselves. They would duplicate the screens that I had done, for instance, for individual tanks, and kind of work on it that way. And Juan Pablo got very, very good at ignition over those years. One of the driving forces for Juan Pablo to get into ignition was he had had a third party come in and do some work for him on shipping and receiving and batching and things like that, and really wasn't satisfied with what they had done. They did things in Visual Basic, and he couldn't modify the programs, and he would have to pay the person to come in and do modifications. So he said, if I can do this in ignition and learn that myself, I can create a lot of projects myself. During this time, Juan Pablo was heavily getting into the SQL Server side of ignition, doing a lot of database work, had migrated what they called the Jasmine database from RSView 32 into ignition, and eventually got rid of the RSView 32 side. So for a while, we had RSView 32 and ignition running side by side, and both, you could operate the machine from both, but eventually they shut down the RSView 32 side and went entirely to ignition. That's the way we migrated that. So we had done two things here. We had migrated from a Slick 500 into a ControlLogix, and we had migrated from RSView 32 into ignition completely by, I'd say, 2016, 2017. During that time, other things would come up. For instance, I had to work on the blower, and the bottle blower is a Siemens S7-400. Of course, I teach Siemens, so I understand the programming. A lot of it was in statement list, but this was a pretty closed program, and there weren't any comments, and a lot of the data blocks and things were, you didn't exactly know what was in there because we didn't have a full commented copy of the program. We had an old program that was actually for a different blower, and we made it work eventually using the comments that were in the other program and kind of combining it by importing data blocks and things into a new project. So I started working on the blower, the filler that was also a Siemens S7-300, and the conveyor system in about 2016, 2017. During that time, I also held a PLC class using my own material, my own book, which I had published that year. That was PLC Hardware and Programming, and I had a couple young guys from Cuba in there, and they were just learning to speak English, David and Daniel. And Daniel ended up starting his own systems integration company and doing a lot of work, especially in ignition for American Beverage Depot later. And David, very smart guy, ended up going into working for another systems integrator. So this became a kind of a common problem with American Beverage Depot. They would get guys in that were smart, and they would learn enough about the United States and about systems integration that they could leave and go get themselves a systems integration job instead of working in a bottle plant. So that was a problem for Juan Pablo. He couldn't seem to keep the maintenance guys that he would hire. As soon as they got trained up and good at the system, they would move on to somewhere else. Before we dive back into today's episode, let me tell you about the team behind Mastering the Machine. When your manufacturing operation needs to level up its automation game, there's one name you need to know: Automation Consulting, LLC. Whether you're integrating new systems, training your workforce, or need expert consulting on industrial automation challenges, we speak both human and machine language fluently. From PLC programming to process optimization, we help manufacturing companies bridge the gap between what is and what's possible. We also host the ultimate training platform for automation professionals. At the Automation Academy, we've created your complete automation learning ecosystem. Our subscription-based training platform gives you unlimited access to comprehensive video courses on systems integration, PLCs, and HMIs. Download technical documents, software tools, and resources that you can actually use in the field. Plus, get personalized job aptitude assistance to advance your career in industrial automation. But here's the best part. Connect with fellow automation professionals on IO Central, our exclusive social media platform where the automation community shares knowledge, solves problems, and builds the future together. Whether you're a seasoned engineer or just starting your automation journey, everything you need is at www.automationllc.com. That's automationllc.com. Join the subscription platform where automation expertise meets community. Now back to today's episode. At the system, they would move on to somewhere else. Let's see, 2017, 2018, I started working heavily on the PET line. We did a big modification there and migrated part of it into Allen Bradley control of the conveyors. We integrated the Siemens and the AB together, and we put that all into the ignition system and created some local HMIs, usually using WinView, which is the same thing as WineTech. That's what all of their operator interfaces have migrated into. We also, in 2018, started evaluating turning the Cermex shrink wrapper, which was very old and was driven by a PCS7 and an S7300 with Profibus and a rebranded Control Techniques type servo drive, and most of the logic was in the servo drives. They were actually called Leroy Summers. Instead of being red like Control Techniques, they were green, but they used the Control Techniques really hardware and software. And so we started evaluating what would it take to upgrade this to ControlLogix and make it work with, say, a Kinetics system. During that time, the Kinetics 300 was a pretty good choice, but we really had a problem. One of the things that I tell people when I'm doing a conversion is, especially because I'm only working there 2 weeks at a time, and because you can only shut down for so much time, you need a way to go back. You need a way to be able to reverse whatever you've done in case it doesn't work by the time that you've given to start it up. So we said, okay, we're going to recreate this completely in ControlLogix, but we are going to have to change all the motors. We're going to have to make adapters from the old motor mounts to the new motors. How can we do that in such a way that we can plug the old system back in and replace all the motors? And we eventually came up with the solution that there's no way to do this in 2 weeks. You're not going to be able to unbolt all the motors and simply plug new ones in and replace everything. You'd have to put everything on wheels. It would cost a lot. So this took, I'd say, 2 or 3 years of evaluation, and we did some testing and wrote a program that interfaced with the PCS7 system using Allen Bradley, and we were able to make the PLC end of it work pretty well, but never did get new servo motors on there and running. During this time also, we did a total redo of a palletizer that was really kind of something that just somebody had built. I think a third party had built by hand, and we modified it a lot. And Daniel Rodriguez really went in there and converted it from an old MicroLogix into a newer ControlLogix, put a WineView touchscreen on there, and we always called this Paletizadora. And I got a lot of the initial stuff done. Juan Pablo did a lot of the modification of the formatting, so the different levels and the directions that the boxes would be as it palletized these. And so that worked pretty well, but this was not a really fast palletizer, so we have concepted new ways of modifying it further with another project that we have coming up, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. 2019, one of their technicians that had come to work there but then gone to work for somebody else, his name was Joandro, started doing facilities acquisition, working with the compressors and some of the water towers and cooling and heating systems in the plant, and bringing that into a ControlLogix system and tying that into ignition. So we did a lot of ignition work that year. Also, I was putting in a new data collection system and had tied that into the syrup room and collecting a lot of historical data. And then Juan Pablo was doing a lot of the shipping and receiving stuff in ignition. So ignition was growing massively by 2019. 2020, COVID came along. A lot of people know about the tornado that hit my facility simultaneously, and I was very fortunate in that Juan Pablo, his company was deemed an essential service by the government. So I got special permission to be able to drive through Florida, stay in hotels, and work on their systems really early on. I think, say within 2 months of when COVID hit, I was able to do that, and everything was very quiet at that time. If you remember correctly, everybody was staying home and not able to stay in hotels, not able to fly, and things like that. But I actually had a lot of work in 2020 and 2021. We built, for instance, a mini CIP. We took an old GE CIP system and completely rewrote it using a Micrologix 1400 and, of course, yet another WineView HMI. During that year, I also built a vision system to examine bottles as they came through the conveyor. We bought a little flatbed conveyor, put a couple Cognex cameras on it, and I kind of proved how that worked. Juan Pablo came up here to Nashville, and we had a little bit of fun just tweaking around with the machine vision system. This is still not in the plant, but he ended up buying the conveyor and the machine vision system, and it's ready to put on the modifications that we're going to do probably this year or next year. 2021, lots more ignition, a lot more data acquisition from the plant. 2022, I drove down there again a few times, and we modified several top-tier palletizers, both upgrading them from Micrologix processors into CompactLogix processors. We also put some encoders onto the processors and made them work with the CompactLogix processors. And we also started working on the conveyor system in the PET line, which is PET is bottle blowing. And they had bought a couple of big spiral conveyors, and the idea was to take boxes of bottles through the shrink wrapper that I mentioned before and up into the ceiling and across the plant and down into a palletizer, leaving room underneath to put a fourth Tetra Pak line. At the time, they had 3 Tetra Pak lines making the box juice, and they wanted to put a fourth one in there and really didn't have room. So we started on this spiral system, which is it's a ControlLogix-based system that runs a bunch of new conveyors, takes the old conveyors, which I called Zone 3. I had already modified that, and would turn it into a new Zone 3 and possibly even a Zone 4, and bring everything into the palletizadora or possibly a new double-decker palletizer. And so we started on that project, and that's still not in there, even though I think the spirals are in place now. They have decided against the 4th Tetra Pak line for right now, or they've been able to make it fit around the existing equipment. So it's not super urgent that they do that. But we've done all the design, we've built the panels, put new drives in there for all of the conveyors. And that machine vision system is going to be used to inspect the bottles, make sure that they're in the right form to be able to go up those spirals, because once everything is up on the ceiling, if you can't see it and it gets jammed, you're going to have a real big problem with things backing up on the spiral conveyors, which is a big no-no. You really want to make sure they're separated, or getting stuck on the upper conveyors. That would be really bad too, because then all the boxes might back up behind each other and actually fall 30 feet to the floor and smash people. So that would be a very bad thing. So we started on that, worked on that through 2024. In 2024 also started ordering pasteurizers from Argentina, and when they came in, they had some problems with the program. So we modified the programs and we put them on ignition and really started doing a lot more on the networking side of the plant. There was a new guy who's an old friend of Juan Pablo's from when he was very young in Argentina, named Jose Sebastian, and he came out and he kind of became the IT guy for American Beverage Depot, with some help from an IT guy that works for a related company down in Argentina named Fernando. And Fernando knew ignition fairly well and knew IT, and is helping to train Jose. I've gotten to know Jose quite well also. One of Jose's purposes is American Beverage Depot can be very disorganized. They're doing so many different things at one time. And Juan Pablo himself would say he's not the most organized person in the world. He's always doing 20 different things and just stacks things up in his office and puts them in the wrong places. And Jose is very good at organizing all that stuff for him. So he's almost like an assistant to Juan Pablo. And they're the same age, and I think now they're about 37 years old each, and good buddies outside of the plant also. So that's worked out really well. And then 2025, working on those PET conveyors, they also bought a new B&R shrink wrap system to replace that old PCS7, and they put that in. That is officially in there running right now, and I actually had to take a B&R class with, I believe it was Andres Mancia, is on a 2-year, maybe a 3-year contract straight from Argentina, and he's a very good systems integrator from straight in there, and we've started getting into even project management. So we are going to try to organize the projects a little bit better. I've been down there this year. It is currently July, and I was there 2 weeks in January, 2 weeks in February, 2 weeks in April, and then have done some remote work. So I've done a decent amount of work down there on everything from the PET conveyors to the ignition system to project management and project organization. Andres is there now and able to go online and fix anything that needs to be fixed. So that's a very good thing. Hopefully that'll work out well long term. But we're really getting into more of the organizational things. And now, of course, ignition is quite polished up and pretty good system. The plant is much more organized, much more modern. But as you would imagine, there are still lots of problems associated with running a full plant. They have about somewhere around 80 employees, and they're trying to run everything. And of course, things are changing quickly here. Some of their raw materials cost more. They're constantly having to, get new customers and satisfy old customers. They do a lot of co-packing, which means companies will come in, like Apple and Eve will say, okay, can you make this many boxes of juice for us using our branded boxes for delivery to our customers? And American Beverage Depot is very used to doing that. Co-packs for companies like, I suppose, Nestle, and makes the water, makes soda pop, makes their own brand of soda pop called Goliath, and lots of juice. They make their own branded juice also called Goliath, and they made Aloha water for quite a while, but they don't make that water anymore. It's really not economical to make water and sell it, even though they do have to ship water a lot of times with their juice, especially if they're on cargo container ships for various reasons. But this is really not about the business applications of American Beverage Depot. I really just wanted to describe how things have evolved over the last 12 years. I consider it very successful, even though it's not necessarily done the way an American company would do it. They don't have the deep pockets to be able to hire large vendors for things like, beverage processing vendors that are very expensive, or use the most modern equipment, go up to ControlLogic's L80 series or anything. So what they do is they do a lot of in-house modifications. They have quite a bit of mechanical capability there through Guillermo, the maintenance manager I mentioned, and now with Andres, he's very good at systems integration. He has completely modified the CIP system and upgraded that to TI Portal. I believe it's an S7 1200. I think there's an S7 1500 in there also. So we're getting to the much more modern ControlLogic's platforms and TI Portal platforms. And over time, we'll probably replace a lot of the different PLCs in there and, of course, bring them into ignition. There was a rumor at one time, somebody at Ignition said, you may have built the largest single server ignition project that we have ever seen. And the main reason for this is, like I said, they're doing everything from shipping and receiving to some human resources to security to, of course, data acquisition from all of the systems throughout the plant, to facilities, to power management, to everything within ignition. So it's been a real honor to be able to work with them and work on their ignition system and learn and kind of make things up as we go along. We don't always do things necessarily the very best way that could be done. I don't claim to know how to do that, but I like to think we've had a very good mutually beneficial relationship where I've been able to help them a lot. They've given me a lot of business, and I've become very good friends with a lot of the people there. Luis de la Vega, the plant manager, who's getting not too far from retirement age like myself. Guillermo Sparacino, who is, as I mentioned, the maintenance manager, one of the hardest working men I've ever met. Works 6 days a week, probably 72 hours a week for most of his life. Juan Pablo Garbin, who is basically pretty brilliant, has learned a lot of this stuff on his own. Very good PLC programmer as well as ignition programmer. Andres Mancia, my new friend from Argentina, very good systems integrator, who's here also struggling with having to learn a new language, learn English. Himself and his wife have moved here. And then Jose Sebastian, who has also moved here from Argentina and is learning English and lives here with his wife also. So hello to all the American Beverage Depot, as we call them, ABD folks, and thank you for all the business over the years. And that's me signing off for this podcast. Well, that's a wrap on this episode of Mastering the Machine. Whether you're headed back to the production line or entering sleep mode, remember, in the world of automation, we're all learning to speak the same language. Thanks for joining me today, both my human listeners and any AI overlords who might be tuning in. Until next time, keep your sensors sharp, your processes optimized, and your curiosity fully operational. This is Frank Lamb signing off. Stay automated, stay amazing.